3, 2, 1, go!
Добрый вечер, дорогие друзья. Мы начинаем нашу сегодняшнюю встречу в рамках ярмарки интеллектуальной литературы Non-Fiction Online и недели популярной науки Alpina Non-Fiction Week. Меня зовут Анна, я представляю издательство Alpina Non-Fiction, и сегодня будет выступать Карл Циммер, известный научный журналист, популяризатор науки и автор множества известных книг на русском языке. Были изданы книги «Паразит, царь природы», «Тайный мир самых опасных существ на Земле», «Эволюция, триумф идеи», «Микрокосм Яколи и новая наука о жизни» и книга «Она смеется как мать. Могущество и причуды наследственности», которая уже стала бестселлером. Мы поговорим сегодня о наследственности в самом широком смысле этого слова, ведь на то, что родители передают своим детям, влияет множество факторов. И это в том числе культура, традиции, география, экономики, технологии и то, в каком состоянии мы оставим после себя планету. Карл Циммер знаменит своим умением рассказывать понятно о сложном и не раз уже доказывал звание одного из лучших научных журналистов мира. Я передаю слово Карлу Циммеру. Спасибо всем, кто нас смотрит.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be speaking with you all. I'm sorry that I can't be there with you in person, but hopefully with vaccines around the world, that might become a possibility again. In the meantime, I thought I would talk to you about my book, She Has Her Mother's Laugh, which is, as Anna said, about heredity. So I'm just going to share the screen to show you some slides as I speak. All right. Great. So I've written 14 books, and each book has sort of a different genesis. In this case, you know, I'd always been fascinated by heredity, how we think about how heredity shapes who we are, the way we talk about it, and certainly becoming a father. I have two daughters. That certainly made me, a keen observer of heredity. I suppose I wanted to see if I could observe myself in my kids. And, they've turned into, two wonderful young women, but I'm not sure how much credit I should be taking for, the good parts that I see.
Ничего, зато потом все прям чики-брики. Очень хорошо.
Sorry, I'm hearing a lot of sound.
Супер. Переводчик подключился, прям там все.
Excuse me, I'm not able to speak over the sound of someone talking. Okay, thank you. So heredity, is certainly something that I've always thought about, but as a journalist, I've certainly been aware of how our relationship to heredity has changed in recent years. And it's largely changed, I think, because we have come to see it as simply having to do with DNA. And a large part of that, certainly in the United States and perhaps elsewhere, is that we have companies that will provide you with DNA sequencing, which is a remarkable thing, but that we've never had before. But on the other hand, I think we are imbuing it with a lot of meanings that it might not be there.
Заставка мне ушла только. Все, ничего, заставка. Давай сейчас перенесем коробочку к тебе. Хочешь? У меня уже нет. На 7.
I'm hearing a conversation. I can't really speak.
У меня же, по идее, ну здесь. Так, а тебе надо даже до 7 закончить, значит, все, да? То есть не тащить все барахло сюда сейчас? Полюбе. Значит, когда нам вас ищут взять, да? Извините. Ну, тут телефон. Чем помочь, Миша? Свести, если что.
Okay, thank you.
Переводчик пишет Кате, выключите себя, Карл их слышит.
I'm going to have to wait, and I can't hear over the Russian that I'm hearing. I'm sorry, I can't give my speech, so I'll have to wait until you resolve this.
Завьючено что-то.
Can we continue? Okay, thank you. So I'm sorry about the interruption. So these companies are providing us with all sorts of information about what we have inherited from our ancestors. And this is very serious information. So this is a slide from 23andMe, an American company. And it is giving you information about a genetic variant that is strongly associated with Alzheimer's. And there's no doctor that interprets this for you, no genetic counselor. You just get this email with this information on it. So this is just a sample one, but that 23andMe supplies. But what would you say if you got this? You do not have the epsilon 4 we tested. Okay, is that good news? Is that bad news? Does this mean that you are at less risk of Alzheimer's, greater risk? What would you do if you knew that you were at greater risk of Alzheimer's? Given that there is no effective treatment for Alzheimer's, how do we use this kind of ambiguous knowledge about our heredity? In addition, there is a lot of information we're getting about where our ancestry can be traced. And so what do we inherit from people who were in a particular part of the world? What does that say about us? And what does it say if people have very complicated ancestries from many different places? So in working on my book, I decided to go back and to really understand the Western origins of the Western concept of heredity. All cultures have a sense of how we are connected to the past. And in my book, I talk about some of the different versions of this, what you could call heredity. But I focus largely on the Western concept, partly because that is the environment that I am from. So I can explore that with the most confidence, but also because I think that the kind of genetic testing and the very gene-centered view of heredity comes out of the Western tradition, very much so, and for good and for bad. The word heredity, I'm afraid I don't know what it would be in Russian, but the word heredity in English is similar to a number of words in other languages that all trace to the word hereditas from Latin. And that actually did not refer to DNA or to genes or to really anything that we can connect with our modern sense of a sort of biological heredity. Hereditas referred to the things and the rights that you gained from someone else when they died. So it's a very legal term. Things were passed down from one generation to the next. And this concept was carried on into medieval Europe. And there, perhaps the most important right would be the right to the throne of a country, given that these were monarchies. So what justified that right? Why was it that a king inherited the throne, the crown, from their ancestor? Well, there was a concept of royal blood that started to emerge, that there was something innate, something physical that had a continuity between a king and a prince. And you could draw the connections of blood using trees, genealogical trees. So some of the earliest genealogical trees, like this one, were used as justification for power. This was why Edward IV could be the king of England. And of course, as you can see here, it's not a simple genealogy. It's messy. And yet the kings would try to draw very simple straight lines to justify their power. Usually these trees led back from the king in the Middle Ages all the way back to King David of the Bible, because that somehow was like the ultimate authority. And so everybody supposedly could trace their ancestry to King David, and that justified being a king. The fact is with genealogy that if King David is in fact the direct ancestor of anyone alive today, he's probably the ancestor of all of us. I can talk about that later if you want. So it's fascinating to see how as the Middle Ages give way to the Renaissance and moving towards the Enlightenment, that you start to see people just starting to think about heredity in a way that we can recognize as something like we think about it. And my personal favorite example is from Michel de Montaigne, the essayist, and he wrote an essay that was inspired by having kidney stones. He was very uncomfortable and annoyed by having kidney stones. And as he was suffering, he thought about the fact that his father, at about his age, in his 40s, also had kidney stones. And so he thought, well, I must have gotten this vulnerability, this susceptibility to kidney stones from him. But then he thought, well, that's actually that's a difficult question. He realized how difficult it was. And he wrote about this in this wonderful essay I highly recommend called Of the Resemblance of Children to Their Fathers. And so there he writes, it is likely I inherited the gravel, that refers to kidney stones, from my father, for he died sadly afflicted by a large stone in the bladder. And then he thinks about this and he realizes that there's a very difficult question here, because his father, when Michel was born, did not have kidney stones. So he writes, while he was still so remote from the disease, how could the light trifle of his substance out of which he built me convey so deep an impress? Where could the propensity have been brooding all this while? In other words, where did this capacity to have kidney stones, where was it hiding? How did it get from him to me? And then where was it inside of me until now? These are profoundly important questions about biology, about heredity, about our existence, really. Unfortunately, it would take centuries for science to answer them. In my book, I talk about how some of the first clues to the modern sense of heredity came from farmers, from people like Robert Bakewell in England in the 1700s, would take different breeds of sheep and breed them together very carefully over many generations, and actually then generate an entirely new breed of sheep. This was a marvel. People were amazed at how he did it. He became famous for creating a new breed of sheep just in a matter of years. And he did it in a special barn which had no windows in it because he didn't want anyone seeing what he was doing. And his success and the way that the new Leicester sheep were able to pass down their traits from one generation to the next in a stable way, that fascinated many 19th century scientists. It fascinated Charles Darwin, for example. He wanted to understand how this had happened. It also astonished Gregor Mendel, who is considered, the first geneticist before there was genetics. In the 1850s, he ran these very famous experiments where he would cross pea plants, and he would take, for example, white flowered pea plants and pink colored pea plants, and he would breed them together, and then we would get nothing but these hybrids, which were all pink. And then he would breed those pink hybrids together, and a quarter of their offspring were white again. So, just as Montaigne had been wondering about where the propensity for kidney stones had been hiding, here we have this question of, look, where was the whiteness of the flower hiding in the generations? It goes away and then it comes back. Now, Mendel himself was not able to answer this. He spoke of factors that could be dominant and recessive, but he couldn't really get further than that. And his fellow scientists at the time really couldn't grasp the importance of what he was discovering and interpret it. So it actually took about 50 years of cell biology, of studying things like chromosomes for scientists to realize that that there were actually physical things inside of the cell which you could assign to these traits. And these came to be known as genes. And William Bateson, who coined the name genetics for this new science in 1900, said the whole problem of heredity has undergone a complete revolution. So there was this real sense of hubris that heredity had been unlocked, and that now is just a very simple matter of finishing up, just cleaning up a few messes in the corners. Now, it is true that there were a number of great successes early on in the history of genetics. And one example comes from Charles Davenport, an American geneticist. Charles Davenport is a very complicated figure with a very complicated legacy, as I'll explain. But to his credit, he was able to help establish that human diseases are passed down. Some of them are passed down in the way that Mendel had envisioned. Now, Mendel was able to do experiments with plants, and Davenport could do experiments with animals. He would do breeding experiments with chickens and canaries and other animals. But he knew he couldn't do that with humans, but so he recognized that instead what he could do is he could use genealogies. He could look at family trees, he could ask people about their ancestors and their relatives, and he could infer how traits were passed down by following Mendel's rules. One example he looked at was a disease called Huntington's disease. This is a neurological disease that only affects people usually in their 40s, 50s, or later. And so it's very much like the kidney stones that Montaigne was worrying about. And it's a devastating disease. Here in the United States, perhaps the most famous person to have it was the folk singer Woody Guthrie, who's shown here playing his guitar. And so this is a paper by Davenport. And what he does here is he went and his researchers interviewed a number of families in New York State where there was Huntington's was common. And he was able to show that the way it was passed down through the generations was what you would expect if it was a dominant mutation on a single gene. In other words, if you were the child of someone who had Huntington's disease, you had a 50% chance of inheriting that dominant gene, and then you would have Huntington's disease. This is a diagram that someone made, which is very helpfully shows how dominant characters get passed down. It's not from the paper itself. Now, you'll see this paper here, it has the term eugenics in it, which I would imagine be kind of disturbing, and it should be. But the fact is that you could have scientists like Davenport who are doing important science of genetics, of heredity, and were eugenicists. And this is the very complicated legacy of heredity that we're still dealing with 100 years later. In the case of Huntington's disease, Davenport was very much right. We know now that it is a dominant gene, a dominant mutation. We know what gene it is. It's called HTT. And we know exactly where in the gene the mutation takes place. It's this little thing here called a CAG repeat. And we know that that mutation affects the protein that's encoded by that HTT gene, which is called Huntington protein. And this is a reconstruction of it. And that is made in our brains. It's not entirely clear how the mutation changes this protein in a way that gives rise to the disease, but it's clear enough that you can get a genetic test to know if you carry that mutation. We can zero in precisely on it. But Davenport really felt that he could solve not just Huntington's disease, but seems like pretty much all of human nature with his family trees. So in the United States, there was a family called Hersofts who were famous as boat builders, shipbuilders. And so he made a family tree because they had built ships through the generations. And he claimed that some sort of capacity was passed down from generation to generation, almost as if there was some sort of boat building gene. Now we can laugh at this example, but there are other examples of a similar approach to human nature where Davenport's effects were very harmful. And the one that I focus on in my book is a case in the state of New Jersey, which is near New York City. And there was a school in the early 1900s called the Vineland Training School. And this was for, the phrase in the United States at the time was for the feeble-minded. That term could cover people with Down syndrome, people with epilepsy, people who were simply difficult in the classroom. They could all be sent to this institution if their parents or others chose. There was a psychologist who was employed there named Henry Goddard, and he became very interested in standardized intelligence tests, IQ tests as they're known, and he introduced them from Europe to the United States. And he was studying his students this way when Davenport wrote him a letter and wanted to know if he could do research on his students and their families, like Davenport had been doing on Huntington's disease. Maybe there was a feeble-mindedness gene that was passed down through the generations. This was all very new to Goddard and very exciting. And so he sent out researchers to talk to the families of these students and believed that he had found things that were as clear as what Mendel had found. And one of the key examples that he wrote about had to do with a girl named Emma Wolverton, who tested a little bit lower than average on his tests. And so therefore he decided that she must be feeble-minded and therefore there must be some gene that she had inherited. And he created this elaborate tree here. Deborah is shown in the lower left-hand corner. The black squares and circles are supposed to be feeble-minded individuals, and the white ones are not feeble-minded, normal. And he claimed that she had an ancestor, shown here in the center of the tree, who had had a child with a feeble-minded girl, and that had produced this long line to the right of feeble-minded descendants, and then later married a woman who was not feeble-minded, and then produced people who were not feeble-minded. And so he really believed that this was proof that that genetics explained the inheritance of feeble-mindedness, of crime, of all sorts of undesirable characteristics. I should point out, and I explain in length in the book, this tree is fiction. This tree does not correspond to reality at all. Nevertheless, he published it in a book called The Kallikak Family. That was the name that he gave to the Wolvertons. And he claimed the biologist could hardly plan and carry out a more rigid experiment. And he said that the data that he was collecting quote, was among the most valuable that have ever been contributed to the subject of human heredity. So you can tell that Goddard was quite arrogant about how he had cracked human heredity. And in fact, in the United States and elsewhere, this view was embraced. So this is from a major magazine in Washington, D.C., where the writer sees Goddard as explaining a sin, explaining the sin of criminal behavior as being wrapped up in feeble-mindedness, and it all being explained simply by heredity in terms of genetics. In Germany in the early 1900s, there was a similar kind of eugenics program that was emerging, and in Nazi Germany, this gave rise to basically campaigns of sterilization and extermination. It's really striking that how they would use American eugenics as justification. This is a movie still from a short educational movie that was shown in movie theaters in the 1930s in Nazi Germany. This is German for Heredity. And in the movie, there's a discussion about Mendel, about heredity, about flowers and animals. And then when they get to humans, they say, well, it's no different, and that we have to do something about the feeble-mindedness that is being inherited. And as evidence, they show a version of the tree that Henry Goddard had shown in his book, The Kallikak Family. The legacy in the United States is not as terrible as in Nazi Germany, but it's nothing to be proud of. Tens of thousands of people were sterilized over the course of the 20th century, justified by their being unfit. And Henry Goddard himself, Charles Davenport himself, personally worked to get politicians to pass laws for sterilization. They believed in this wholeheartedly as an important thing. So, it's one of the terrible ironies of all of this is that when William Bateson declared that the problem of heredity had essentially been solved, he knew nothing about genes and what they were made of. He could see how some of the effects of how they were passed down and inherited, but no one at the time knew what DNA was for, that genes are encoded in DNA. This is the kind of thing that you may see in a school textbook that children learn on a regular basis. Our genetic information is encoded in these 4 letters, as it were, in our DNA. This did not become clear until the 1950s and 1960s, long after Bateson was dead. So now we think in terms of heredity, in terms of our DNA, in our genome, which is the sum of our DNA. But there's a huge amount of it, and it's very hard to make sense of. This gentleman actually printed out all of his DNA as letters in books, and you can see it fills a lot of books. So really, it was only 100 years. It took 100 years after William Bateson had founded the science of genetics that actually we got our first look at a human genome. It was a very crude look, filled with mistakes, and it was a very expensive one. It cost about $3 billion. But the cost for sequencing genomes has plummeted from $3 billion to $100 million, then down to under $1,000 now. And it's going to keep falling as new technology gets developed. So in my book, I took advantage of an opportunity to get my genome sequenced, and I actually wanted to get the data in my own hands. And so here it is. Actually, I received a hard drive from the company Illumina, which is genome sequencing company. And then I use that as a way to explore my own heredity and to understand how scientists look at genomes to understand heredity. So, for example, this is my brother, and you know, he got a simpler DNA test that allowed us to compare our DNA on a sort of a high level. These are chromosomes, and the red chromosomes and the orange chromosomes are all sections are all identical stretches of DNA that we have. The blue are different. You know, and that's because we inherited DNA from our parents. The DNA gets shuffled before it gets passed down to the next generation. So I may have a piece of DNA that I inherited from our maternal grandmother, whereas my brother may have inherited that same piece from our maternal grandfather. But you know, this kind of similarity in a genome you only get if you're very closely related, like brothers. So we are indeed brothers. I was able to establish that. I didn't have much doubt before, but I have none now. This is not my brother, but this is a good painting of one of my ancestors and probably one of yours. This is a painting of a Neanderthal. And you can look in our genomes now to see our ancestry among Neanderthals, because scientists have been able to get bits of DNA out of Neanderthal fossils. And so now we can look at them and see how very similar stretches of DNA are present in our own genomes. How did this happen? Well, Neanderthals expanded, the ancestors of Neanderthals and Denisovans expanded out of Africa maybe about 600,000 years ago. Our ancestors, Homo sapiens, stayed in Africa, remained there, and it seems like the main expansion happened about 70,000 years ago. As humans expanded, Homo sapiens expanded out of Africa, they encountered other humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and they interbred. And some of those hybrid children were part of human society and passed down their DNA to later generations. And we, living humans today, have inherited some of that. And so depending on where you are on Earth, you have maybe a few percent Neanderthal or Denisovan DNA. In some places, maybe just 0.1%, but everybody's got it. But you have different combinations of pieces of DNA from either Neanderthals or Denisovans or both. And you know and so that shows you that, you know, our family trees are, that simple branching is just an abstraction, really. This is just this gives you an idea of all the interbreeding that's happened over time. And this is actually a very simplified version. There are more arrows that could be added to it now. So because I had my genome, I could go to scientists and say, well, okay, it's fine that I have, I forget what the number is. I think I'm like 1.4% Neanderthal, something like that. I didn't really care about that. I want to know about the genes. And so they provided me with a list. So this is the beginning of a list of several hundred genes out of about 20,000 genes that we have. These are ones that I have that are from Neanderthals. What does that mean? Well, we don't know. In many cases, we have no idea what genes do at all. And in cases where we do know something about what they do, we don't understand what the difference is between having a human version and a Neanderthal version. It's a huge mystery, but an exciting one, and one that maybe will lead to new kinds of medicine going forward. I was actually quite surprised just in the past few months to see this kind of Neanderthal medicine come to light as we all deal with the pandemic. You know, as a reporter, I have been pretty much only writing about the pandemic since, I guess, March. And some of what I would do, just to, introduce people to the virus and explain how it works, what we know about it, and what scientists are learning about it that could help us to fight it. And one of the biggest mysteries about COVID-19 is that for most people, they either don't know that when they get infected, if they have no symptoms, or they only have very mild symptoms. And yet there are, maybe roughly 20% of people who get infected have to go to the hospital. And of those, some of them just need a little bit of oxygen and then they can leave. And then others do much worse and then die. And there's still not much you can do for people. There's no there's no guaranteed cure. There's no pill you can take that makes it all just go away. Excuse me. So scientists are trying to understand, well, what explains why some people get severely ill and some don't. And so they're just looking at various risk factors. And this is one that was published a little while ago from the United Kingdom. And you can see that there are factors that seem to be tied to people's risk of having severe disease. Smoking, being male, being Black as opposed to white, age makes a huge difference. One of the most surprising things turns out to take us back to Neanderthals. So scientists have been looking at people's DNA and saying, is there a variant that you find very commonly in people who have severe disease, more than you would expect by chance? So that would suggest that it puts you at risk. And a few candidates are emerging, a few spots on their DNA. And the most promising one is on chromosome 3. And this is a graph where that red there kind of shows you exactly where it is on chromosome 3. And there's a few genes in there in that section that scientists are looking at very closely now to understand, well, why is it if you inherit this piece of DNA, are you at such high risk, 3 times higher risk than if you don't have it? What's amazing is that piece of DNA, it comes from Neanderthals. So I wrote about this over the summer, and the paper has been published just about a month ago in Nature, I believe. And so, the question then becomes like, well, why would it be that Neanderthals would have a variant of some gene on chromosome 3 that turns out to put you at such great risk of disease? It could be that Neanderthals were adapted to other kinds of diseases in Asia, and that this was part of their immune response, and that now for this particular virus, it's a very bad response. That's one theory that people are putting forward. It's very early days in understanding this, but I just wanted to show this to show how Neanderthal medicine is not a curiosity. It is actually central to some of our most pressing healthcare problems. But one of the important things in terms of understanding genetics and heredity is to remember that usually there's not a single gene for something. Our genes influence us, and they influence us in a complicated context of our environment, of our experience, of our culture. And in my book, I used one of the simplest examples possible: height. So height is not something that you need fancy scientific equipments to measure and to understand. You just need a ruler, a tape measure. And scientists have long been fascinated by why some people are extremely tall and some people are extremely short. And it gradually became clear, looking at the statistics of height, that height was what scientists call very heritable. What that means is that the tall parents tend to have tall children, and short parents tend to have short children. In other words, that you can explain the variation in height due to a large amount of that variation in the variation in genes. The problem is that until just the past maybe 15 years, we didn't know really what those genes were. So in the book, I write about Joel Hirschhorn, who is a pediatric endocrinologist who treats children with hormone conditions. And so in some cases, he's treating children who are very short. But usually what he told me was that what that means is that parents will bring in short children and they will want to be very concerned for their children. And he will tell them, your child is perfectly healthy. It's just, your child's height doesn't have any impact on his health. And then they'll say, well, why is he so short? And then there would be an awkward silence when he'd be looking at these parents and then have to say, like, well, you are not very tall yourself. And they would want to know about these genes, and he didn't know what they were and couldn't tell them. And eventually he just decided he wanted to search for them. And so what you do is you have to collaborate with a number of scientists, and you have to look at a lot of medical records tied to DNA information. And basically, look at the range of human height and try to find genes that are unusually common in people who are taller than average or shorter than average. And so in 2007, after years of searching, he and his colleagues, looking at almost 5,000 people, found one variant. And it's one gene, and they're not really sure why it influences height. If you have 2 copies of the sort of tall version of this gene, it's like putting on a pair of socks. It's not a big influence on height on average. And they knew that there must be other genes that influence height out there. This is not like a single gene like Huntington's disease. So they looked for more people, and year after year, they kept finding more variants. And so this chart shows you how it's grown over the past 13 years. I'm sorry, I apologize. The bar on the right should be 2020, not 2200. We're not there yet. So basically, we are now at the point where there are 9,900 variants that have been found that influence height in one way or the other. And it's a very, no one can really say yet, like, how all of those variants work together to influence how tall a person becomes. Because height may seem simple, but you think about it, like, you're talking about a body with trillions of cells. Those cells are dividing in a very coordinated fashion, and then they stop together at a certain point. So there's a lot involved there. So a simple trait like height is actually quite complex. And so, to think that people like Goddard and Davenport could then say, like, oh, intelligence could be something reduced to a single gene is absurd. And as I mentioned, I mean, you can have a trait that is what scientists call heritable, and yet that doesn't mean that genes are the only thing that affect it. And I can use height as an example. So here is a chart showing the average height of women in Canada and the Barbados, the Caribbean islands. And you can see it's in centimeters. It's a substantial difference. And so you might say, oh, well, women in Canada must have certain genes that just make them taller than women in Barbados. They have tall genes for tallness. What you need to know is that this is old information. This is from 1896. Scientists have been keeping track of heights over the past century or so, well, 150 years actually in some places. And if you look at these statistics, you see major changes in height. So all over the world, people have tended to become taller, substantially taller. And in the case of Canada and Barbados, the women of Barbados have actually gotten taller than the women of Canada. So what might have looked like some absolute essential difference produced by heredity turns out to be strongly influenced by the environment. What do I mean by the environment? Well, in this case, I mean that children are getting more food, they're drinking cleaner water, they're getting medicine. All these things allow their bodies to channel energy away from fighting disease and stress and towards growth. And so, so to understand something like height and what you've inherited, it's not just genes you inherited, it's your social conditions. You know, children today are being born into a society that was constructed. And it's a different kind of society that people were born into in 1896. So I just wanted to close by turning from the past to the future. Because in the future, we are going to be able to manipulate heredity if we choose to in ways that were thought to be science fiction before. Now that we understand how DNA is encoded, we can change it. We can change it. We can change it in embryos. We can change it in a way that can be passed down from one generation to the next. I write in the book about the rise of one way of changing DNA known as CRISPR. You know, there have been people who have used it to recode human embryos. And you know, in 2018, He Zhongqiu, a Chinese scientist, announced that he had actually changed genes in 2 embryos, which were were implanted and are now 2 baby girls. In Russia, there is a scientist who has proposed doing something similar with deafness. And just, you know, before I wrap up, I just want to just point out that, you know, on the one hand, we cannot imagine that we can control heredity in any sort of simple on-off switch way. On the other hand, we may make changes that we don't know with unexpected changes. So, for example, you know, there's a gene for called clotho, and there's a variant that protects people from Alzheimer's. Maybe people in the future want to put that into embryos of their children. Who wouldn't want to protect their children from Alzheimer's? Well, it also turns out to enhance memory. So if you're concerned that, if you're okay with preventing disease, but not comfortable with enhancing future generations, well, here's one case where you can't have one without the other, perhaps. So this will be a very difficult ethical issue to deal with. And as we think about these ethical issues, I just want to close by saying I hope that we keep the memory of Emma Wolverton alive. You know, Emma Wolverton was through false ideas about heredity was kept in institutions for her whole life. She did not need to be institutionalized, but it was felt that heredity had doomed her to this subhuman life. And we cannot make that kind of mistake in the future. We've made that mistake and many more like it with heredity in the past. We have to, as we grapple with heredity, we have to keep remembering that these are human beings that we are and that others are, and that heredity is more than some sort of simple idea about, say, genetics. So, excuse me. Thank you so much for spending your evening with me. I'd be happy to take questions. And if you want more information, you can go to my website or follow me on Twitter. So thank you. And I'll turn off the share.
Спасибо. Хочется в первую очередь поблагодарить за обстоятельную и интересную лекцию. И вот возник такой вопрос. Ученые сейчас, как вы сказали, знают больше о наследственности и могут вмешиваться в естественный ход вещей. Какие этические проблемы встают и еще могут встать перед деятелями науки?
Well, one thing I point out in the book is that we look at the ability to edit DNA as being a very controversial area, something that is going to happen in the future, and we need to think about what will happen again in the future. But the fact is that we are already doing this kind of thing. So I mentioned Huntington's disease. So there are cases where people with Huntington's disease will control heredity. And the way they will do it is they will use in vitro fertilization, and they will basically like decide which eggs or sperm are used to fertilize an embryo, because to produce a fertilized embryo. Because if you can choose between an egg that has the Huntington's mutation and an egg that doesn't, you can say, I want my child to not inherit this disease. I don't want to leave it up to chance. I want to make the decision for that child. So I think that if you feel that eugenics is by definition the control of human heredity for the benefit of future generations, that seems like eugenics to me. But and yet I don't think that it would be hard to imagine objecting to that, to saying that parents shouldn't be allowed to do that. So I think we have to sort of we are already in that ethical gray zone, and I think we need to really take that more seriously. I don't think we're taking it seriously enough yet.
Спасибо. Расскажите, пожалуйста, еще с какими псевдонаучными домыслами о наследственности вам чаще всего приходится сталкиваться, и, может быть, какие-то особенно запомнились?
Well, I think that racism is the big pseudoscience of heredity, and I write a lot about race in my book. The concepts that underlie racism today are based on ideas that were already scientifically falsified over 100 years ago. But the more that we are able to look at genomes of people around the world, the more we can understand the complexity of human genetic variation. And so when people, the racist view of the world is that people are divided into very cleanly separated groups, and that everyone inside that group has the same collection of traits, and that you can rank them in terms of moral worth. This is wrong in many different ways. In one way is just that human genetic variation is far more complex than that. You could actually, if you could imagine a terrible situation where some terrible pandemic or a nuclear weapon wiped out all of humanity except for a few small tribes, maybe 1,000 or 2,000 people in the middle of the Amazon. Actually, I think the number is about 80%. About 80% of all human genetic variation, genetic differences between people on Earth would be preserved in that small group. In other words, there's far more genetic variation within populations than between populations. Things that we think of as characterizing different groups are not as fixed as we might think. So, racism is generally very tied up with white supremacy, the idea that whites are superior, and we just use that term white as if somehow having light skin is some sort of marker of superiority, which is just false. If you go back maybe just 6,000-7,000 years in Europe, people there were dark-skinned. Many people there were dark-skinned, and if you go back even to like 10,000 years, pretty much everyone in Europe was dark-skinned. It was actually, the genes for lighter skin were actually introduced from largely from the Near East. Racism is an extremely harmful ideology. It actually affects people's health because of the way that people are mistreated. And it is, the more science we learn, the more we recognize that it is based on nonsense.
Спасибо. И еще один вопрос. Всем обычно очень хочется знать, что все-таки больше влияет на человека. Это гены или среда, в которой он растет и воспитывается?
Well, I don't think you can pick one or the other, I'm afraid. And it sort of depends on what you mean, what you're talking about in particular. So if we're talking about your blood type, your environment doesn't matter at all. Your blood type is completely encoded by your genes, and it's not going to change because you live on a farm or live in a city or what have you, or live on the top of a mountain. Your blood type is your blood type, and it follows very clear Mendel-like rules of heredity. Now, if you want to talk about our personalities, the things that are we think of as our identity, which have more to do with the mind, then things get much, much more complex. Even there, the influence of genes and environment are so linked together that it's almost meaningless to sort of pull them apart. If you look at intelligence tests, it can be a very heritable trait. But that being said, there are plenty of things in the environment that can affect an individual's intelligence. Just one very important example is lead and other pollutants. If children are exposed to that, they lose points on those tests. Likewise, there have been studies in places like Sweden where children were shifted to spend an extra year in school, that actually added points on these tests. So you can see that the influence of genes and the environment are just all mixed together. And in fact, sometimes people will say, well, the environment's all that matters, because if your parents have lots of books around the house and so on, then you will be in that environment where you will sort of be nurtured to develop your intellect. That does seem to be true, that the environment you grow up in does influence how you do on these measurements later. But that environment that your parents build is actually also influenced by genes as well. So scientists are actually able to start to zero in on individual genes that have an influence on the kind of environment that your parents create, that then influences personality traits. I think trying to split them apart and say, oh, this one wins and this one doesn't is it's not interesting. You miss the wonderful complexity of the interplay between them.
Спасибо. Я напоминаю, что с нами сегодня был Карл Циммер, известный популяризатор науки, научный журналист и автор книги «Она смеется как мать. Могущество и причуды наследственности», о которой мы сегодня говорили. Спасибо и всего доброго.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.